I grew up on a farm outside Des Moines, and for most of my childhood, life out there felt painfully normal. Endless fields, early mornings, long summers smelling like dirt, gasoline, and rain. My parents owned hundreds of acres of cornfields, stretching so far you could stand in the middle of them and see nothing except rows of corn moving in the wind like waves on an ocean. During the day, the farm felt peaceful. At night, it became something completely different. By the time I was 16, I'd already gotten used to strange sounds outside after dark: coyotes screaming in the distance, rusted machinery groaning in the wind, the occasional animal wandering too close to the house. But every now and then, usually late at night during harvest season, my dad would become strangely tense whenever the dogs started barking toward the cornfields. Not barking normally either, terrified barking, the kind where animals don't want to go near something. One night, during late October, I finally asked my dad what kept bothering the dogs. I remember we were sitting on the porch while rain clouds rolled slowly across the fields under moonlight. My dad stared toward the corn for several seconds before quietly saying, "If you ever hear someone calling your name from inside the field after midnight, don't answer." That was it. No explanation, just that warning. I laughed at the time because honestly, it sounded ridiculous. But the expression on his face stayed completely serious. Looking back now, I realized he wasn't joking at all. A few weeks later, my parents left overnight to visit relatives in another town, leaving me alone to watch the farm. Rain had been falling on and off since evening, turning the dirt roads around the property into thick mud. Around midnight, the power went out during a storm, leaving the farmhouse completely dark, except for lightning flashing through the windows every few seconds. I remember sitting in the kitchen with a flashlight, listening to rain hammer against the roof, while the dogs outside barked non-stop near the barn. Then, suddenly, they stopped. Complete silence covered the farm. No barking, no insects, nothing. Even the rain somehow sounded quieter for a moment. That's when I heard it. Someone calling my name from the cornfield outside. Softly at first, almost impossible to hear through the storm. I froze immediately. The voice sounded distant but familiar, like someone standing deep inside the field trying not to yell too loudly. At first, I thought maybe my parents had come home early. Then the voice called again, closer this time. It sounded exactly like my younger sister. The problem was, my sister was 3 states away at college. Every hair on my body stood up instantly. I remembered my dad's warning immediately, but before I could even process what was happening, the dogs started whining outside, near the back porch. Not barking anymore. Whining. Scared. Another lightning flash illuminated the yard outside for half a second. I saw movement in the corn. Something tall moving between the rows about 50 yards from the house. At first, I thought it was just a person walking through the field. Then, lightning flashed again, and I realized whatever it was had to be at least 7 feet tall because the tops of the corn stalks bent around it while it moved. The voice called my name again. Now it sounded like my mother. "Can you help me?" The thing in the field stopped moving. I slowly backed away from the kitchen window while my chest tightened so hard it hurt. Deep down, part of my brain still tried finding logical explanations, but instinct already knew something was wrong. Very wrong. Then came the knocking. 3 slow knocks on the back door. The dogs immediately started growling. I stared toward the hallway leading to the back entrance while thunder rolled outside. Another set of knocks followed, slower this time, more patient. Then my father's voice spoke from the other side of the door. "Open up!" My blood went cold instantly because through the living room window, I could still see my dad's truck missing from the driveway. The voice outside knocked again. "Son?" The dog suddenly backed away from the door, whining loudly. I could hear something breathing heavily outside now. Not human breathing either. Wet, deep, like huge lungs struggling to pull in air. Then the voice changed again. My sister? Then my mother? Then mine. It kept repeating my own voice back to me from outside the door while rain poured endlessly across the farm. Panic finally hit me hard enough that I grabbed my dad's shotgun from the hallway closet and locked myself inside the upstairs bedroom. The knocking continued for almost an hour, sometimes at the back door, sometimes downstairs windows, once directly outside my bedroom. Near 3 a.m., everything suddenly stopped. No knocking, no voices, no movement outside. Eventually, exhaustion must have knocked me unconscious because the next thing I remember was sunlight coming through the bedroom window. The storm had passed completely. At first, everything looked normal. Then I saw the cornfield. A massive path had been flattened through the crops, leading directly from the field to the farmhouse. The stalks looked crushed inward like something enormous had crawled through them during the night. My dad returned home an hour later, and the moment he saw the damaged field, his expression completely changed. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew. That night, for the first time in my life, he finally explained why nobody in our family ever went near the North Cornfield after dark. Years earlier, before I was born, a farmhand disappeared out there during harvest season. Search parties looked for him for nearly a week without finding anything except his boots abandoned deep inside the field. After that, people started hearing voices at night. Familiar voices, calling from the corn. I asked my dad if he believed it was the missing farmhand. He stared silently toward the fields for a long moment before answering. "No," he said quietly. Then he looked directly at me. I think something found his voice. I spent one summer working on a cattle farm outside of Amarillo when I was 22 years old. At the time, I was desperate for money after dropping out of college halfway through the semester, and a friend of my uncle offered me temporary work helping around his property. The farm sat miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dry fields, fences, and endless empty land that seemed to stretch forever beneath the Texas sky. During the daytime, the place felt exhausting but normal. Long hours repairing fences, feeding cattle, cleaning equipment, and hauling supplies beneath brutal summer heat. Nights were different. Nights out there felt isolated in a way I'd never experienced before. The farmhouse sat near the center of the property, beside an enormous red barn that looked older than everything else around it. The wood had darkened from decades of storms and heat, and parts of the roof sagged badly enough that my boss, a man named Walter, kept saying he'd probably tear it down eventually. Still, despite how unstable the barn looked, he had one very specific rule about it. Nobody was allowed inside after sunset. He never explained why. Every time I asked, he'd just say, "Nothing good happens in there at night." At first, I assumed he was hiding illegal livestock or something equally boring, but after a few weeks on the farm, I realized the rule genuinely scared him. Every night around the same time, usually somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, the barn door would slowly open by itself. I noticed it the second week I worked there. My bedroom window faced directly toward the barn, and one night during a thunderstorm, I happened to glance outside after hearing a loud metallic creak. The giant front door of the barn had swung halfway open despite the heavy chain Walter always wrapped around it before bed. At first, I thought the wind had forced it open, but the strange part was how slowly it moved. Not violently, slowly, like someone carefully pulling it from the inside. The next morning, Walter noticed the open door immediately. I expected him to blame the storm, but instead, his face went pale. Without saying a word, he grabbed his shotgun from the truck and walked toward the barn alone. I watched from the porch while he disappeared inside for nearly 15 minutes. When he finally came back out, he looked visibly shaken. I asked him what happened in there. He stared at me silently before answering. "If you hear knocking from the barn at night, ignore it." That answer stuck in my head for days. A week later, Walter had to drive into town overnight for a livestock auction, leaving me alone on the property to watch the farm. Before leaving, he repeated the same warning again while locking the barn doors with heavy chains. "Do not go inside that barn after dark," he said, "no matter what you hear." Then he drove off down the dirt road while evening storms gathered over the fields in the distance. By midnight, heavy rain hammered across the farm while wind rattled the farmhouse windows hard enough to wake me several times. Around 1:30 in the morning, I heard the barn door creak open again. Even from inside the house, the sound carried clearly through the storm. I looked outside through my bedroom window and immediately felt my stomach tighten. The barn doors stood wide open, and the lights inside were on. That made no sense. The barn didn't even have working electricity anymore. Walter had mentioned that several times while complaining about repairs. Yet warm yellow light now spilled through the open doorway onto the muddy ground outside, while rain poured endlessly across the fields. Then, I heard knocking. 3 slow knocks, coming from inside the barn. At first, I tried ignoring it, exactly like Walter warned me to, but the knocking continued every few minutes, echoing through the storm outside. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The rain felt freezing against my skin, while mud sucked at my boots as I crossed the yard toward the barn. The closer I got, the worse the smell became. Rotting hay mixed with something sour underneath, like spoiled meat left in the heat too long. The inside of the barn looked far bigger at night than it ever had during the day. My flashlight moved across old farming equipment, rusted tools, and empty cattle stalls, while rain hammered against the roof overhead. The strange yellow light I saw earlier came from somewhere deeper inside the structure, beyond the main floor. Then the knocking came again, louder now, from beneath me. I froze immediately. Another knock followed, directly under the wooden floorboards near the back of the barn. I slowly approached while my flashlight shook in my hand. Hidden beneath old hay bales and broken planks sat a large wooden trap door built into the floor. Thick chains wrapped tightly around it from the outside. Deep scratch marks covered the wood around the edges, like something underneath had repeatedly tried clawing its way out. Then a voice spoke from below.
"Walter?"
The voice sounded weak, human. I crouched closer to the trap door without thinking. "Who's down there?" I asked. For several seconds, only rain answered. Then the voice came again. "Please let me out." Panic crawled into my chest immediately. Part of me wanted to run straight back to the house, but another part genuinely thought someone might actually be trapped beneath the barn. The voice sounded desperate, injured maybe. Then I noticed something else. The chains around the trapdoor looked old, ancient almost, rusted deeply into the wood like they'd been there for years. No normal person could have survived locked under there that long. The voice spoke again, closer now somehow. "I know you're not Walter." My breathing stopped for a second. Then, slowly, something knocked back from underneath the trapdoor. Not with fists, with nails. Long scratching drags across the wood beneath me. I backed away immediately. That's when the voice changed. It became Walter's voice perfectly. "Open the door." My blood went cold. Walter was supposed to be hours away. The thing beneath the trapdoor started laughing softly using his voice, while the scratching underneath grew louder and more frantic.
Suddenly, the entire trapdoor shook violently, hard enough to rattle the chains across the floor. Dust fell from the ceiling while something slammed repeatedly against the wood from below. Then came another voice. Mine. Help me. I ran. The laughter followed me through the barn while heavy impacts shook the floor behind me. I barely made it back to the farmhouse before hearing a loud metallic snap echo through the storm outside. One of the chains had broken. I locked every door in the house and stayed awake until sunrise holding Walter's shotgun while footsteps slowly circled the farmhouse outside all night long. Sometimes the thing scratched at windows. Sometimes it whispered through the walls using different voices. My mother's, my old friends, even mine again. Walter returned just after sunrise. The moment he saw the broken chain hanging from the barn trapdoor, his face completely drained of color. Without saying anything, he grabbed several new chains, extra locks, and a container of salt from the truck bed before heading toward the barn alone. I quit the job later that same day. Before leaving, I finally asked Walter what was under the barn. He stayed silent for a long time before quietly answering. My grandfather found it in the fields back in the 1930s. I asked what it was. Walter looked toward the barn nervously. Then he said the one sentence I still think about constantly. It only sounds human when it's hungry. I spent most of my childhood on my grandparents' farm outside Lincoln. Every summer, my parents would drop me off there for weeks at a time while they worked in the city. The farm sat miles from the nearest town and seemed to stretch forever in every direction. There were wheat fields, old barns, grain silos, ponds, and gravel roads that disappeared into the countryside. During the day, it felt peaceful. I would help my grandfather repair fences, feed livestock, and drive old tractors around the property. But there was one place on the farm that always made me uncomfortable: the south field. It looked completely normal except for a single scarecrow standing near the center. The thing was old, even by farm standards. It wore a faded flannel shirt, torn overalls, and a burlap sack over its head. Every evening before sunset, my grandfather would glance toward the south field and make sure nobody stayed there after dark. Whenever I asked why, he always gave the same answer: because it doesn't like being watched at night. The summer I turned 17, my grandparents left for a family reunion and asked me to watch the farm for 4 days. Before leaving, my grandfather repeated all the usual instructions about livestock and equipment. Then he hesitated for a moment and looked toward the south field. "If the scarecrow isn't where it's supposed to be in the morning," he said, "don't go looking for it." I laughed because I assumed it was another one of his strange jokes, but he didn't smile. He got into the truck and drove away without another word. The first 2 days passed normally. I handled chores, watched television at night, and enjoyed having the entire property to myself. The third evening, dark storm clouds rolled across the countryside. The wind picked up shortly after sunset, bending the wheat fields like waves across the landscape. By midnight, heavy rain was hammering against the farmhouse windows while thunder rattled the walls. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when a bright flash of lightning illuminated the south field. For a split second, I noticed something strange. The scarecrow wasn't there. I stood up and looked through the window again. Another lightning flash lit the field. The scarecrow was definitely gone. At first, I assumed the storm had knocked it over. Still, something about seeing that empty spot in the field bothered me. I tried convincing myself it wasn't a big deal and returned to my book. About 20 minutes later, I heard 3 slow knocks on the front door. The sound immediately made me look at the clock. It was 2:11 in the morning. Nobody should have been visiting a farm that isolated during a storm. I walked to the window beside the door and carefully looked outside. The porch was empty. Rain poured from the roof, but there wasn't a person in sight. Before I could fully process it, 3 more knocks echoed through the house. This time, they came from the back door. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. The front and back doors were on opposite sides of the farmhouse. Nobody could have moved between them that quickly without running through deep mud and heavy rain. I grabbed a flashlight and looked through the kitchen window toward the backyard. A lightning flash illuminated the property. Standing near the barn was a tall figure. It wasn't moving, it simply stood there facing the house. Another flash came a few seconds later. The figure was closer. I hadn't seen it walk, it was just suddenly nearer than before. Then another flash lit the yard. That's when I recognized the shape. The hat, the overalls, the burlap head. It was the scarecrow. I stumbled backwards so quickly that I nearly fell over a chair. Every logical explanation I could think of collapsed immediately. The scarecrow should have been standing in the south field, half a mile away. Instead, it was now standing in my backyard during a thunderstorm, staring directly at the farmhouse. Before I could react further, the dogs outside started barking. Not aggressive barking, terrified barking. The kind animals make when they desperately want something to stay away. Then the barking suddenly stopped. A few moments later, I heard footsteps above me. Not upstairs, on the roof. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossed the shingles while rain hammered against the house. The sounds moved from one end of the roof to the other. Sometimes they stopped for several seconds before continuing again. I grabbed my phone and tried calling my grandfather, but the storm had completely killed the signal. The footsteps eventually stopped above my bedroom. Then, silence filled the house. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard scratching. The sound came from my bedroom window upstairs. My bedroom was on the second floor. There was no ladder outside. The scratching continued, long, slow drags across the glass. I stared toward the staircase while my heart pounded so hard I could hear it. Then something tapped against the window. 3 times, slowly, patiently. I locked myself inside a downstairs storage room with my grandfather's shotgun and stayed there until sunrise. Throughout the night, I heard footsteps circling the house. Sometimes there was scratching against walls. Other times, it sounded like something was slowly walking through the wheat field outside. Whatever it was, it never tried forcing its way inside. It simply stayed close, as though it knew I was there. When morning finally arrived, the storm had passed completely. Sunlight covered the farm and everything looked normal again. The scarecrow stood exactly where it always had in the south field. For a few hours, I almost convinced myself the entire night had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Then I walked outside. Mud covered the ground around the farmhouse, and in the mud were footprints. Hundreds of them. They circled the house over and over before leading toward the south field. Against my better judgment, I followed the tracks. They ended at the scarecrow. Hanging from one of its straw-filled arms was a piece of fabric. My bedroom curtain. The curtain had been ripped from the inside of my second-floor bedroom window during the night. My grandparents returned later that afternoon. The moment my grandfather saw the fabric hanging from the scarecrow, he became completely silent. After several minutes, I finally demanded an explanation. He sighed and looked toward the south field. Decades earlier, according to local stories, a farmer had vanished there during harvest season. Search parties never found a body. A few months later, workers started reporting that the scarecrow appeared in different locations around the farm after storms. Most people assumed it was a prank, until the sightings became impossible to explain. Eventually, everyone in the area developed a simple rule: never watch the south field after midnight. I asked my grandfather whether he actually believed those stories. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed toward the scarecrow. Its head had moved. Not much, just enough that it was now facing directly toward the farmhouse. My grandfather stared at it for several seconds before quietly saying, I don't know what it is, but every storm, it gets a little closer.